Hi guys, so in this video we're just going to talk about the factors of production. We will first start off in this part of the course with defining some key terms in the factors of production. We will then look at land, labour, capital, enterprise, with a lot of focus on labour as a factor of production. So of course, first of all, you guys are aware, some of you know from junior cert business, that the factors of production are land, labour, capital and enterprise. To just extend that a little bit further, when we look at land, the reward or the return on land is rent, so people can earn money from owning land by just renting it. For labour, we know that people give their labour in exchange for a wage. For capital, so normally for capital, if you purchase capital, you might purchase it on credit, and the people who give it to you will earn interest on that capital. And then finally, enterprise, which is the only one that has both a negative and positive return. So the negative being, or the positive being profit. The entrepreneur can earn profit, but they can also make a loss. So the first key term we're going to look at is marginal physical productivity, or you'll see it pop up in the notes as MPP. And this is the extra output produced when an additional unit of a factor of production is employed. So for example, if we employ an extra worker or a machine, how much more goods are produced. So if we take an example of a bakery, and let's say we have 5 workers who can make 20 cakes, but they only have one oven. Well, what we would be interested in knowing is what would happen if we added one more oven. So if we add this extra oven and we end up with 30 cakes, then we know that the MPP is equal to 10 cakes. And I just get that from taking 30 from 20. When we look at the extra or the additional unit of factor of production, we could also be talking about labour here. So maybe what happens if we have 6 workers instead of 5 and we still only have one oven. So when we look at factors that can influence marginal physical productivity, first of all, if we're talking about labour, it's the quality or specialised nature of the factor. If the quality of the factors used improves, then they become more efficient and additional output will be provided. So let's say for example in the case of our bakery, we add a oven that has a conveyor belt, so that when you put the cake in one side of the oven, it moves the whole way through for a period of time that it takes to bake a cake, let's say 15-20 minutes, and then it comes out the far side, meaning that you can put one in, it'll move through the belt, and as it's maybe halfway through the oven, you can put another cake and it makes it a little bit quicker. The second one here is the education or training that's provided for the factor. So if the factors are trained, they become more skilled, resulting in increased efficiency and more output. So in the case of our bakery, if I train one particular person to become a cake decorator, so they know how to put on the icing, to make different models for the cake, to put on the candles, then they're going to do that quicker than somebody else in the bakery who, let's say for example, maybe is in charge of mixing the ingredients. The more trained up or the more education that your factor has, in this case labour, the more skilled they become, and they become much more efficient. The third thing is the expertise of the entrepreneur. So if the entrepreneur is an expert in organising the production unit, then each factor will be more productive and work to their maximum efficiency. So in the case of our bakery, the person who owns the bakery should be somebody who has a lot of experience in that background, who knows exactly what is required, what different sections of the bakery that you need, and who would fit those sections perfectly. So your entrepreneur should have some sort of knowledge of the background. And then finally, the law of diminishing marginal returns. So we've seen a law of diminishing marginal utility before. Returns is no different. We just change utility to a factor of production. a good to a factor of production. So as each additional unit of a factor of production is used, a point will be reached where the additional output produced will decline. So let me just explain that with an example. Okay, so let's take our example of a bakery, and we have to make one cake, and we have one baker to make one cake. Then we know that if we have to bake the cake, mix up the ingredients, cook it, and then decorated, that would take a lot of time. So it might be better if we have 2 bakers to bake the cake. So that might do it a lot quicker. We might find that if we've to make 2 or 3 cakes, now we find it's good to have an extra baker. But what if we have another baker? And then let's say we add another baker. What's going to happen is all of these bakers are going to get in each other's way. So that's what they mean by the law of diminishing marginal returns. As an additional unit of labour is added in this case, a point will be reached where the additional output produced will decline. Because what's going to happen is if these guys are all only to make one cake, let's forget about these 2. They're all going to start getting into getting in each other's way, okay? And you remember that old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth. So from marginal physical productivity, what we really want to know is we want to know about the money we get when we add an additional. So when companies are thinking about taking on more staff, or they're thinking about buying another machine, this is what they're really thinking about: marginal revenue productivity. And you'll see that come up as MRP. So marginal revenue productivity is the extra revenue earned when an additional unit of a factor of production is employed. So it's used by firms to decide whether to hire more workers or buy new machines. And the MRP formula is very, very simple. I don't really think you're asked to calculate much in Leaving Cert. I think I've only ever seen it come up once. But it's the marginal physical productivity. So for example, in our last slide, we had 10 cakes was our marginal physical productivity, and we multiply that by the marginal revenue. So some factors that influence MRP. First of all, the productivity or the commitment of the factor. So the more productive each additional factor employed is, then the more MRP that factor will earn. So if we take the example of labour, the more conscientious a person is, that is, a person, if you are employed to do a job and that you're willing to do that job, that you're not trying to cheat or trying to do as little as possible. So for example, let's say you are a delivery van driver, and rather than deliver the goods, you sit in a petrol station all day drinking coffee. Well, then you're not very conscientious. You're not trying to do the right thing, which is actually do your job. So the more conscientious a person is, then the more productive that person will be. So what we're saying here is if they are lazy, then MRP will be low. Okay, so it's not always the case that MRP is high by adding another unit of labour. The second thing is the selling price of the output, and a really good example here is houses. So if the selling price obtained on the market is rising or constant and not falling, then the higher will be that factor's MRP. So if we look at construction workers or labour, okay, and if we look at house prices at the minute in Ireland are constantly increasing, rising. So people who build those houses, if they want to increase their marginal revenue productivity, what they'll need to do first of all is build more houses. And the best way of doing that is to add more labour, so employ more people to build the houses, and then that will increase the MRP. Finally, the law of demand influences marginal revenue productivity. So in the market, the law of demand dictates that in order for more to be bought, then the price must be reduced. And this affects the MRP obtained by the firm. Now we know that's not the case for every good. When we're looking at house prices there, we know the house prices or housing is a speculative good. So people may buy more of it now because they think that the price will increase in the future. But in general, if we look at the law of demand, which applies to a lot of goods, then we know that in order for people to buy more, then the price must be reduced. And briefly, I'm just going to look at difficulties that might arise in measuring MRP. So marginal revenue productivity, we know, is dependent on physical output. So we said that the formula was MPP multiplied by marginal revenue. But what happens if you can't actually measure MPP? So if you look at the example of services that are provided, so an example might be teachers or nurses, and whether you need to add more. Well, they don't actually produce a physical output. They give a service. So teachers provide education, nurses provide healthcare. So MRP cannot be measured in that case, and therefore when we look at, we know teachers and nurses are paid by the government, whether they're trying to figure out whether to add more teachers or more nurses, it's very hard for them to look at MRP and whether adding more teachers or more nurses would result in higher MRP. Second of all is output that's not sold in the marketplace. So for example, in the public sector, our output is not sold in the market, and therefore it's difficult to calculate MRP. And then finally, the combination of capital and labour to produce additional output. So it's difficult to measure the contribution of each individual factor. So looking at our example from earlier, where we see that one cook can make one cake, and if we have two cooks, maybe we can have two cakes. But what happens, for example, if we add an additional oven? So let's say we only have one oven, and now we have two ovens, and we add another cook. All of a sudden we have three cakes. We don't know whether the increased output was because of the additional baker or whether it was because of the additional unit of capital. In this case, it was an extra oven.